When I married Julia 10 years ago, I thought I had hit the jackpot. She was brilliant, driven, and had a laugh that could make a room full of strangers feel like old friends. Our relationship wasn't perfect, no one's is, but it felt solid. We had two beautiful kids, a cozy home in the suburbs, and a rhythm to our lives that felt predictable in the best way. Until it wasn't. The cracks started small, so small I didn't even notice them at first. Julia was working long hours at her law firm, her career steadily climbing while mine seemed to plateau. I didn't mind being the steady one, the one who picked the kids up from school and made dinner while she worked late. It was a team effort, or at least that's what I told myself. But somewhere along the line, something shifted. Julia was distracted, her phone always glued to her hand. She started taking calls in the other room, lowering her voice when I walked by. I chalked it up to work stress, big clients, big responsibilities, but there was a distance between us that I couldn't ignore. Our lives changed further when Julia insisted we hire a babysitter. "Jason, I can't keep juggling everything," she said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table. "I need help. We need help." It was hard to argue with her. Between her late nights at the office and my increasingly long hours at my tech job, it felt like we were running on fumes. The kids, 7-year-old Ellie and 5-year-old Ben, deserved more attention than we could give them. So, we hired Emma. Emma was a college student, young but responsible, with an easy smile and a natural way with the kids. Ellie adored her immediately, and Ben followed her around like a puppy. She started coming by 3 evenings a week, giving Julia and me some much-needed breathing room. At first, it seemed like a godsend. Emma's presence gave us time to focus on work and, on the rare occasion, each other. But as the weeks went by, that distance between Julia and me only seemed to grow. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the couch with Julia, a rare moment of quiet between us. "How's work?" I asked, hoping to spark some kind of conversation. She looked up from her phone, her expression blank. "Busy," she said, her tone clipped. "Anything interesting going on?" "Not really," she said, her attention already drifting back to her screen. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. I wanted to reach out to her, to ask if something was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nodded, pretending to be absorbed in the news on TV. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I started to notice things. Small things at first. Julia started dressing up more for work, wearing clothes that seemed a little too polished for the casual atmosphere of her office. She spent more time in front of the mirror, perfecting her makeup. "Big meeting today?" I asked one morning as she adjusted her necklace in the hallway mirror. "Something like that," she replied, not meeting my eyes. Emma noticed it, too. One night, after the kids were asleep, she hesitated as she was leaving. "Mr. Dawson," she said, her voice cautious. "Call me Jason," I said, smiling. She gave a small nod but didn't return the smile. "Jason, I just wanted to ask, is everything okay? With you and Mrs. Dawson?" Her question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask?" She hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "It's just, she seems different lately. Stressed, maybe?" I frowned, unsure how to respond. "We've both been busy. It's nothing to worry about." Emma nodded quickly, but her expression told me she wasn't convinced. That conversation stuck with me, though, and I started paying closer attention. Julia's late nights became more frequent, her explanations more vague. "I'm meeting a client," she'd say, or, "I'll be home late, don't wait up." And then there were the texts. Her phone was always buzzing, her screen lighting up with messages she didn't seem eager for me to see. One night, while she was in the shower, I caught a glimpse of her phone on the kitchen counter. A message flashed across the screen. "Can't stop thinking about earlier. When can I see you again?" My stomach twisted. The sender's name was saved as Chris, work, but something about the message didn't sit right. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. Should I confront her? Demand an explanation? But before I could decide, the bathroom door opened, and Julia walked into the kitchen, towel drying her hair. "Hey," she said, glancing at me, then at her phone. Her expression flickered, just for a second, before she picked it up and slid it into her pocket. "What's up?" she asked, her tone casual, but there was a tension in her voice that hadn't been there before. Nothing, I said, forcing a smile. Just thinking about work. But the truth was, work was the last thing on my mind. That night, as I lay awake in bed, my thoughts spiraled. Had I imagined it? Was I reading too much into a text that could have been innocent? Or was it exactly what it seemed? A sign that Julia was hiding something? Emma's words came back to me, her quiet observation that something felt off. She was right. Something was off. And I couldn't ignore it any longer. The morning after seeing that text, I woke up feeling like my chest was weighed down by a brick. Julia had already left for work, as usual, and the house was eerily quiet. The kids were still asleep, their laughter and energy nowhere to be found in the empty kitchen where I sipped my coffee. My mind kept circling back to that text message. It wasn't just the words. It was the way Julia had reacted when she saw me near her phone, the way she'd slipped it into her pocket like she was afraid of what I might see. For the first time in our 10 years together, I felt like there was something I wasn't supposed to know. I decided not to jump to conclusions, at least, that's what I told myself. Instead, I paid closer attention, watching for clues in her behavior, in the way she moved through our life together like she was carrying a secret. That week, Emma came over to watch the kids while I worked late on a project deadline. When I got home, I found her in the living room, folding laundry while Ben and Ellie played quietly in their room. "How'd they do tonight?" I asked, setting my briefcase by the door. "They were great, as usual," she said, flashing a small smile. But then her expression shifted, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" I asked, sensing her hesitation. Emma looked down at the shirt she was folding, her fingers fidgeting with the fabric. "It's probably nothing," she said. I walked over and sat down across from her. "If it's on your mind, it's not nothing. What's going on?" She sighed, her eyes flickering toward the hallway before meeting mine. "It's about Julia," she said quietly. My stomach tightened. "What about her?" Emma hesitated, as if she were debating whether to continue. "I've noticed she's been distracted lately," she said carefully, "like her mind is somewhere else. And last week, when she came home late, she was here when Julia got home?" I interrupted. Emma nodded. "I stayed a little later because Ben wasn't feeling well. Julia came in around 10:30, and she seemed different, like she wasn't expecting me to still be here. She smelled like perfume, but not the one she usually wears. It just felt off." I leaned back, trying to process her words. "You're sure?" Emma nodded again. "I didn't want to say anything at first because I didn't think it was my place. But I just thought you should know." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to dismiss them, to chalk it up to paranoia, but deep down, I knew Emma was right. Julia had been acting strange for weeks, and now there was no ignoring it. "Thanks for telling me," I said finally. Emma looked relieved, but also a little sad. "I hope it's nothing," she said softly. "You guys are such a great family." I didn't reply. I couldn't. The next evening, Julia came home later than usual. I was in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with the dishes, when she walked in. "Hey," she said, setting her purse on the counter. "Sorry I'm late. Client meeting ran long." "No problem," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Everything go okay?" She nodded, pouring herself a glass of water. "Yeah, just a lot of back and forth. Exhausting, really." Her voice was calm, but I noticed the faint sheen of sweat on her brow, the slight flush to her cheeks. And then there was the perfume, subtle, but different from her usual scent. "Long day for both of us," I said casually. "I might turn in early." Julia glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Okay, I'll be up in a bit." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Julia slept beside me. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I needed to know the truth, but how could I confront her without proof? The answer came the next day, when Emma brought it up again. "Mr. Dawson," she said hesitantly as I walked her to the door after another babysitting session. "Jason," I corrected, trying to offer her a reassuring smile. "Jason," she said, her tone serious. "I think you should check her phone." Her suggestion caught me off guard. "I don't know if I can do that," I said slowly. Emma hesitated, then said, I know it's not my place, but if something's going on, you deserve to know. And so do your kids. That night, after Julia fell asleep, I found myself staring at her phone on the nightstand. My heart pounded as I reached for it, my hand trembling slightly. I knew it was a breach of trust, but the thought of being lied to, of being made a fool of, pushed me forward. The screen lit up when I pressed the button, and to my surprise, there was no passcode. My chest tightened as I opened her messages and scrolled through the most recent ones. There it was. A series of texts from Chris, work, each one more damning than the last. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Think about you all the time. Let's meet at the usual place next week. I don't know how much longer I can do this without you. My breath caught in my throat as I read the messages, my hands gripping the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. The truth was undeniable now. Julia wasn't just distracted. She was having an affair. I set the phone down carefully, my mind spinning. A part of me wanted to wake her up right then and there, to demand answers and force her to confront the truth. But another part of me, the part that still couldn't believe this was happening, held back. Instead, I went downstairs and sat in the dark living room. The messages burned into my mind like a brand. I felt angry, betrayed, but most of all, I felt lost. What had I done wrong? Had I been too distant? Too complacent? Or was this just who Julia had become? A stranger I no longer recognized? The next morning, Julia acted as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, her smile bright and carefree. "See you tonight," she said cheerfully. I nodded, barely able to meet her eyes. That day, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. First, I needed to know the full extent of her betrayal, and I knew exactly who could help me find it. "Emma," I said that evening, as she packed up her things after watching the kids, "do you have a little time to talk?" I stood in the doorway as Emma packed her things, my mind racing with everything I'd read the night before. Julia's texts were undeniable, but I needed more. More clarity, more proof, and more time to figure out how to approach what felt like an unraveling disaster. "Emma," I began, my voice quieter than I intended. "Can we talk for a moment before you leave?" She looked up at me, sensing the seriousness in my tone. "Of course," she said, setting her bag down. We moved into the living room, where she perched nervously on the edge of the couch. I sat across from her, feeling a mixture of guilt and gratitude. "You were right," I said, leaning forward, my hands clasped tightly. "About Julia. Something's going on." Emma's brows knit together, concern etched across her face. "What did you find?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I saw some messages on her phone," I admitted. "From someone named Chris. They weren't work-related." Her face fell, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, and I felt like I was drowning in it. "I'm so sorry, Jason," she said finally, her voice soft. "Don't be," I replied. "You didn't do this." Emma nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I need to figure out how deep this goes before I confront her. I need to know everything." Emma hesitated, then said, "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Her offer caught me off guard, but I could see the sincerity in her eyes. "You've already done more than enough," I said. "But thank you. Really." After she left, I sat in the living room for hours, trying to piece together a plan. The idea of hiring a private investigator crossed my mind, but something about involving an outsider felt too impersonal. This was my family, my marriage. I had to handle it myself. The next few days were a blur of subtle observations and careful maneuvering. Julia continued her routine as if nothing had changed, her bright smiles and affectionate gestures a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. I watched her more closely than ever, noting the way she would glance at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she lingered in the car after pulling into the driveway. Each moment added fuel to the fire of my suspicions, but I kept my emotions in check, determined not to tip my hand too soon. One evening, I decided to test the waters. Over dinner, I casually asked about her schedule. "How's work been lately?" I said, spearing a piece of broccoli with my fork. She looked up, her smile faltering for just a second. Busy as always, she replied. Why do you ask? Just curious, I said with a shrug. You've been putting in a lot of late nights lately. Everything okay? Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see her mind working, calculating her response. It's just a busy season, she said. Big clients, lots of deadlines. You know how it is. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Later that night, when she was in the shower, I searched her purse. My hands shook as I unzipped the side pocket, feeling like a thief in my own home. Inside, I found a second phone, cheap, unremarkable, and very much out of place. My heart sank as I unlocked the screen. There were no messages, no calls, nothing that would immediately incriminate her. But the fact that it existed at all was enough to confirm my worst fears. The next morning, I called Emma. I need your help, I said, my voice low as I stood in the garage, away from prying ears. Of course, she said without hesitation. What do you need? I think she's using a second phone to keep in touch with this guy, I explained. I found it last night, but there's nothing on it. I need to figure out where she's going when she says she's working late. Emma was silent for a moment, then said, I might have an idea. That evening, while Julia was out meeting a client, Emma came by to watch the kids. She brought her laptop, explaining that she'd been studying cybersecurity and could use some of her tools to track Julia's movements. It's not foolproof, she said as she set up her equipment on the dining table. But if we can figure out which towers her phone is pinging, we might be able to narrow down her location. I watched in awe as Emma worked, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I hadn't expected her to have this kind of expertise, but I was grateful for it. After about an hour, she looked up, her eyes wide. Got something, she said. What is it? I asked, my pulse quickening. She's not at the office, Emma said. Her phone's pinging near a hotel downtown. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. I had suspected she was lying, but seeing it confirmed on the screen made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. Do you want to go there? Emma asked hesitantly. I nodded, my jaw clenched. I need to see it for myself. Emma stayed with the kids while I drove to the hotel. The whole way there, my mind raced with a mix of anger and disbelief. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew it wouldn't be good. When I arrived, I parked across the street and sat in the car, watching the entrance. After about 20 minutes, I saw her. Julia stepped out of the hotel lobby, her hair slightly disheveled and her face glowing in a way that had nothing to do with work. She was laughing, her hand resting on the arm of a man I immediately recognized as Chris, her work contact. My blood boiled as I watched them walk to his car, their movements casual, comfortable, intimate. I stayed in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to storm across the street and confront them right then and there, to demand answers and let them see the pain they'd caused. But another part of me, the part that was still clinging to some shred of rationality, held back. Instead, I snapped a photo with my phone, capturing the image of them together as they leaned in close, their laughter filling the night air. This was my proof. This was the truth I needed. And now, there was no going back. The drive home from the hotel felt like a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with every mile. The image of Julia and Chris together, their laughter echoing in my mind, was like a knife twisting in my chest. I had the proof now, the undeniable truth, but it didn't bring the clarity I thought it would. Instead, it left me with a storm of anger, betrayal, and a question I couldn't yet answer. What happens next? When I got home, Emma was sitting on the couch, flipping through a picture book with Ellie and Ben. She looked up when I walked in, her expression carefully neutral as she read the look on my face. You okay? She asked softly, once the kids had run back to their room. I shook my head, my voice low and raw. No, but I will be. She didn't press, and I was grateful for that. After she left, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the photo I'd taken on my phone. Julia would be home soon, and I needed to figure out how to approach this. When she finally walked through the door, I was ready, or so I thought. She greeted me with the same casual smile I'd seen countless times before, dropping her bag by the door and slipping off her shoes. Hey, she said, heading toward the kitchen. Did you eat yet? I can whip something up. Don't bother, I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. She froze, her hand on the refrigerator door, and turned to look at me. What's wrong? I stood, my heart pounding as I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up. This is what's wrong, I said, showing her the photo of her and Chris outside the hotel. Her face went pale, the blood draining from her cheeks as her eyes locked on the screen. For a moment, she didn't say anything, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words that wouldn't come. Adam, Don't, I snapped, cutting her off. Don't you dare try to explain this away. I saw you, Julia. I saw you with him. So, tell me, how long has this been going on? She hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for the counter to steady herself. It's not what you think, she began, her voice shaky. I let out a bitter laugh. Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think it is. So, why don't you save us both some time and tell me the truth for once? Tears filled her eyes, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. It's been a few months, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. A few months, I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. You've been sneaking around behind my back for months, and I'm just supposed to accept that like it's no big deal? It wasn't supposed to happen, she said, looking up at me, her face streaked with tears. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I stared at her, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. You didn't mean for it to go this far? So what was the plan, Julia? To keep lying to me until you got caught? To let him walk out of that hotel like it was nothing while I stayed home taking care of our kids? She shook her head, sobbing harder. I made a mistake, Adam. A terrible mistake. I don't know what else to say. You could start by explaining why, I said, my voice breaking. Why him? Why now? Was I not enough for you? It's not about you, she said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. I've been feeling lost, trapped, like I'm not myself anymore. And Chris, he made me feel alive again. Her words hit me like a slap to the face. Alive? I repeated, incredulous. So betraying your husband and tearing our family apart is what it takes for you to feel alive? I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I felt my chest tighten, the anger threatening to boil over. You didn't mean to hurt me? Julia, you destroyed everything we had. You didn't just hurt me. You hurt Ellie and Ben. You hurt this family. She reached out as if to touch me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. Don't, I said coldly. You don't get to play the victim here. You made your choice, Julia. Now you're going to have to live with it. The silence that followed was deafening. She sat there, her shoulders shaking as she cried, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for her. Not now. Not after everything. Finally, I spoke, my voice low but firm. I want you out of this house. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. Adam, please. No, I said, cutting her off. You don't get to stay here and pretend like everything's fine. You're leaving. I'll figure out what to tell the kids, but I'm done. We're done. She stared at me, her expression a mix of shock and devastation. What about the kids? She asked, her voice breaking. I'll make sure they're taken care of, I said. But you don't get to come back here like nothing happened. This is my home now. This is their home. That night, Julia packed a bag and left. I didn't watch her go. I couldn't. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at the photo on my phone and wondering how we had gotten here. When Emma came the next day to watch the kids, she didn't ask any questions. She simply offered me a small, sad smile and said, "If you need anything, I'm here." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The truth was out, and while the road ahead would be difficult, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Julia's betrayal define me. The morning after Julia left was eerily quiet. Ellie and Ben didn't ask any questions, but I could see the confusion in their eyes as they ate breakfast. They didn't know why their mom wasn't sitting in her usual spot, sipping coffee and scrolling through emails. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. Not yet. It's just going to be us for a little while, I said, trying to keep my voice light. Mom's staying somewhere else for work. Ellie tilted her head, studying me with those sharp, observant eyes of hers. When is she coming back? I hesitated, feeling the weight of the question settle on my shoulders. I'm not sure, I said carefully, but we're going to be okay. We've got each other, right? She nodded slowly, though I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routines. I took the kids to school, went to work, and picked them up in the afternoon. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but beneath it all was the gnawing ache of loss and betrayal. That evening, as I was helping Ben with his homework, Emma arrived to babysit. She had been a lifeline through all of this, steady, kind, and quietly supportive in a way that didn't feel overwhelming. "How are you holding up?" she asked once the kids were in bed. I shrugged, pouring myself a glass of water. Some days are better than others. Today wasn't great. Emma nodded, leaning against the counter. "It's going to take time," she said gently, "but you're doing everything right. The kids are lucky to have you." Her words were a balm to my frayed nerves, but they didn't erase the doubt that lingered in the back of my mind. Was I really doing enough? Was I enough for them, now that half their world had been ripped away? That night, after Emma left, I sat in the living room with a stack of legal documents spread out on the coffee table. Divorce paperwork, custody arrangements. It was all there, a cold reminder of the reality I now faced. Julia had called earlier, asking if we could talk things through, but I hadn't answered. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses again, or to entertain the idea of reconciliation. She'd made her choice, and now I had to make mine. Over the next few weeks, I began to rebuild, one step at a time. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind occupied. The apartment became a safe haven for me and the kids, a place where we could start fresh, free from the weight of Julia's betrayal. Ellie and Ben adjusted surprisingly well, though there were moments when the cracks showed. Ellie would ask about her mom in quiet moments, her voice hesitant, as if she didn't want to upset me. Ben, on the other hand, seemed more withdrawn, his usual exuberance dulled. One evening, as I was tucking him into bed, he looked up at me with wide, solemn eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. His question broke something in me. "No, buddy," I said, pulling him into a hug. "None of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Okay?" He nodded against my chest, but the tightness in my throat lingered long after he fell asleep. Emma became more than just the babysitter during this time. She became a friend, someone I could talk to without feeling judged. She didn't pry, but she listened when I needed to vent, and her presence brought a sense of stability to a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. One evening, as we sat on the couch after the kids had gone to bed, she said something that stuck with me. "You're allowed to feel angry, you know," she said. "You don't have to pretend everything's okay all the time." I nodded, staring down at the coffee mug in my hands. "I know," I said, "but sometimes it feels like if I let it out, I won't be able to stop." "You will," she said with quiet certainty. "And when you're ready, you'll move forward. You already are." It wasn't until a month later that Julia and I finally sat down to discuss custody. We met in a sterile conference room at the lawyer's office, the tension between us palpable. "I don't want to fight you on this," Julia said, her voice quiet but firm. "The kids need both of us in their lives." I stared at her, searching for any hint of the woman I'd once loved. She looked tired, her usual confidence dulled by the weight of everything that had happened. "I agree," I said finally, "but that doesn't mean things can go back to the way they were." "I know," she said, tears welling in her eyes. I want them to be happy." "Then let's focus on that," I said, my tone softer than I expected. "We'll figure out a schedule that works for everyone." The agreement we reached wasn't perfect, but it was workable. Julia would have the kids every other weekend, and I'd have primary custody during the week. It was a bittersweet arrangement, but it felt like the best option for now. As the months went by, the wounds began to heal. Not completely, but enough to function. I found joy in small moments. Watching Ellie perform in her school play, helping Ben learn to ride his bike, laughing with him over burnt pancakes on Saturday mornings. Those moments reminded me that life went on, even after heartbreak. One evening, as I was tucking the kids into bed, Ellie looked up at me with a shy smile. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" she asked. I smiled back, smoothing her hair away from her face. "Yeah, sweetheart," I said. "We're going to be okay. I promise." And for the first time in months, I believed it. The passage of time has a strange way of softening the sharp edges of pain. It doesn't erase it completely, but it blurs the lines, making the memories easier to carry. By the time a year had passed since Julia left, our lives looked completely different, and in many ways better. Ellie and Ben had adjusted to the new routine remarkably well. They split their time between me and Julia without too much fuss, though they always seemed happiest when they were home with me. I never said it out loud, but knowing they felt that way filled me with a quiet pride. The apartment had transformed from a temporary refuge into a true home. The walls were covered in artwork Ellie had drawn and photos of the three of us. The once empty shelves now held books and toys, and the kitchen was always filled with the scent of something baking, usually at Ellie's insistence. It wasn't easy being a single dad, but the challenges no longer felt insurmountable. I learned how to juggle school drop-offs with work meetings, how to soothe tantrums and bandage scraped knees while still finding time to read bedtime stories. Each night, as I tucked them into bed, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't known before. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was ours, and I was proud of it. Julia and I maintained a polite, if distant, co-parenting relationship. She kept her visits consistent and tried her best to be present when she had the kids. I wouldn't say we were friends. We were too fractured for that, but we had settled into a truce of sorts. The anger I once felt toward her had faded into something quieter, something closer to indifference. Roger, however, was a different story. I made it clear from the beginning that he was not to be part of Ellie and Ben's lives. Julia didn't argue. I suspected even she couldn't defend what had happened between them. As far as I knew, she cut ties with him entirely, though I didn't care enough to ask. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, the kids playing noisily in the living room, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Emma standing there, holding a small plant in a terracotta pot. "For your growing home," she said with a smile. I laughed, stepping aside to let her in. "It's starting to feel less like an apartment and more like a jungle thanks to you." She grinned, setting the plant on the counter. "That's the point. Plants make everything better." Emma had become a regular presence in our lives, even beyond babysitting. She was a friend now, someone who had been there through the hardest moments and stayed even after the dust settled. "Stay for coffee?" I asked, pouring a fresh pot. She hesitated, glancing toward the living room where Ellie and Ben were giggling over some elaborate game they'd made up. "Sure," she said finally. As we sat at the table, sipping coffee and talking about everything from work to the kids, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in a long time. Emma had a way of grounding me, of reminding me that life could be good again. At one point, she looked at me, her expression soft. "You've done an amazing job with them, you know?" I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "Thanks," I said. "I've had a lot of help." She laughed, shaking her head. "Don't give me too much credit. They're lucky to have you." As the weeks turned into months, my bond with Emma deepened. What started as friendship slowly grew into something more, though neither of us rushed it. We both knew what it meant to rebuild after loss, and we wanted to take our time. By the time Ellie's 8th birthday rolled around, Emma was a regular part of our lives. She helped me plan a small party at the park, complete with balloons, a homemade cake, and a scavenger hunt that had the kids running in every direction. "Best birthday ever," Ellie declared as she hugged me tightly, her face smeared with frosting. Watching her smile, surrounded by friends and family, I felt a wave of gratitude. We had been through so much, but we had come out stronger on the other side. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Emma and I sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her warmth a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked softly. I thought about her question for a moment, then nodded. "All the time. But for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of it." She smiled, her hand finding mine. "Me neither. Life didn't go back to what it was before Julia's betrayal. It never could. But as I sat there, surrounded by the life I had rebuilt, I realized that was okay. What we had now wasn't perfect, but it was real. And sometimes that's even better.